I'm Madeleine Morris. I'm moderating tonight. I'm a reporter for 7:30 here in Melbourne. 7:30, by the way, not the 7:30 report. Everyone still says 7:30 report. We're trying to slowly change that. And it's my pleasure to be here tonight with you at the Wheeler Centre to discuss this very important issue of Australia's renewable energy, where we're going. Obviously, very much in the news this week as world leaders to talk about climate change at the United Nations in New York. China has just said for the first time that it's going to make deep emission cuts by 2020. Barack Obama said that China and the US need to lead on other nations. Where does that leave little old Australia and our massive greenhouse emissions per capita and our hopes for the future in the renewable energy sector tonight? So the Wheeler Centre has brought together a really fantastic panel to discuss these issues tonight, where we're going. A few issues that we're going to consider, of course, the renewable energy target, what that is going to look like, where that's headed, decentralised electricity movement more generally, the huge numbers of people with solar panels on their roofs and other things as well. The support as part of the not only for the renewable energy target, but other things to do with renewable energy by the governments and the state governments, and also how other countries are tackling renewables as well. This is, though, your question time. This is not a panel discussion. This is an opportunity for you as the audience to ask questions of our assembled experts here tonight. And I'd really encourage you just to put up your hand. We've got Letitia and Jess. So if you've got a question, just put your hand up, and you're the people who are going to make tonight work. So make the most of the opportunity of having this fantastic panel here this evening. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves because they can explain what they do better than I can. Let's start with you, Anna.
Thank you. I'm Anna Skarbek. I'm Executive Director of ClimateWorks Australia, and we are a research and advisory organisation, a non-profit institute founded by the Maya Foundation based at Monash University. We're focused on catalysing emission reductions. Our most recent research has been into the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions, and yesterday, as part of the New York summit, we released a report with 15 other countries that shows how we can achieve a zero-carbon energy system by 2050, so in our lifetimes. And there's a very heavy role for renewables in that, as much as 100% we found in Australia.
We'll get to you to talk a bit more about that as we go on. John?
Yeah, John Grimes. I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Solar Council. The Australian Solar Council is a not-for-profit, non-government organisation. Our mission statement is solar for a sustainable future. We're particularly engaged with the debate around the renewable energy target legislation at present, and we're running a pointed political campaign to try and shift the federal government's view when it comes to solar policy.
Liam.
Liam OKeefe from Creative Environment Enterprises. It's a private company. We offer consulting and sustainability services to a range of local government, state government, and also in the arts and environment sector, particularly with events and festivals. Initiatives that we've been involved with RMIT University is called the Germinate project, which is solar-powered sound systems we take out to events and festivals. So I suppose our perspective is we're involved in innovative decentralised energy projects to go off the grid and to challenge ideas about how solar and centralised energy can work and different applications of that to kind of nurture newer ideas in different contexts. And we've also built a similar type of sound system with Southern Cross University, which is called the Sunflower, and was involved with the Livid Festival in 2014.
So you're doing lots of really interesting things. You're responsible for our solar-powered deep-fried chips at music festivals, are you?
I'd say the deep fryers would probably use up our battery capacity fairly quickly. That deep fryers, any heating uses up a fair bit of energy very quickly. But
maybe the loo.
Sound systems are a lot more efficient, and they probably provide a better result too, I think.
And a lot more important at music festivals as well.
All right. Although chips are pretty important.
That is
don't
true.
play that at all.
They are. All right, Matthew.
Great. I'm Matthew Warren. I'm the Chief Executive of the Energy Supply Association of Australia. So we represent, I guess, all the grid-based utilities, so the network businesses, the transmission businesses, generators, both green and conventional, and retailers. So we're kind of the incumbent grid industry that supplies electricity and gas to Australian businesses and households.
Okay. All right, so, when I walked in tonight and I said, sort of, what should we talk about, you all immediately put your hands up and you said the renewable energy target. And I think that, John, you described it as being a titanic battle. So, I'm assuming that everyone here has an interest already in renewable energy, so you will be familiar with the issues, but why don't you just bring us up to speed on why you see it as being such a titanic battle?
Excellent. Yeah. Well, before the last federal election, the current federal government was very pro-renewables. Tony Abbott promised a solar sunrise. They were going to introduce another 1 million solar roofs. Support was going to be targeted to low-income people who needed it the most. Fantastic. And then they were elected. And for the day they've been elected, they've worked with dedication and zeal to target every climate and renewable energy policy in the portfolio, which has included dropping the 1 million roofs promise, attacking the RET, even though they promised to uphold it, and a whole range of other policies which I'm sure you're familiar with at present. So we're deeply concerned. The RET is the last remaining support for the renewable energy industry. To give you a sort of a sentence on the RET is a target that was introduced originally in 2001 by the Howard government. It's an agreement, bipartisan agreement since that time, to generate electricity from renewable energy. It's expressed as a fixed number, 41,000 gigawatt hours by 2020. And both major parties went into the last election promising to uphold the RET. The Prime Minister has launched a review into the RET. The review was mandated by law, but the law mandated that it needed to be done by independent experts in the Climate Change Authority. They're people who reviewed the RET only 2 years ago. It was headed by Bernie Fraser, the former governor of the Reserve Bank. A Reserve Bank board member, Heather Riddle, was involved. So these are hardly notorious radicals. These are sensible economists. And they concluded that any benefit from changing the RET would be offset by a greater loss in terms of confidence in the sector, investor confidence. They also said that the rooftop solar scheme should not be changed, that the public and the industry needed certainty in that endeavour. So the Prime Minister, instead of getting, as is required under law, those independent experts to again do a quick review, make sure that nothing's changed in the last 24 months, instead he launched his own review. He appointed Dick Warburton, a self-proclaimed climate sceptic. People like Brian Fisher, who's advocated done work for the petroleum industry in the last review, calling for the RET to be abolished. Now Brian Fisher is judge and jury. Shirley Infeld, who ran the largest coal-fired power station in Western Australia. So, look, I just want to give you a flavour. An extremely biased, completely unrepresentative group of people who set about doing a hatchet job on the renewable energy industry in Australia. And every time they could prejudice renewable energy and boost the case for fossil fuel, they did. And I could spend an hour on that alone. I'm not going to, clearly. But the end point is that the Warburton Review has recommended that the RET be abolished. The Prime Minister is driving this personally. It is absolutely his position that he wants to abolish the RET. It's only the politics and the pressure that we, the people, are now exerting on them that's stopping them from actually announcing the abolition of the RET. So, your involvement in this issue is critical right at this point in time.
Is there anyone in the audience who is actually for the abolition of the RET? No. Okay.
Brave enough to put their hand up.
And I've got to say that we're holding marginal seat forums around the country: Petrie, Eden Monaro, Barton. And on the 9th of October, here in Melbourne, in the seat of Deakin, at the Carolina Centre in Ringwood East. And in these forums, we've spoken to thousands of Australians, from the Palmer United Party to the Greens, from small business to investors, from self-funded retirees to manufacturers. And this reaction is what we've had everywhere around Australia. Universally, people say this is not what we voted for, and it's certainly not what we want.
Okay. please put up your hands, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got questions, because this is... Yes, sir, down here. We'll get the microphone to you, and then there you go.
Thanks. I think this is the closest I can go to being opposed to the RET. It's a question, if renewable energy sources are going to generate electricity cheaper and with lower emissions than conventional electricity sources, why do we need to subsidise or mandate the consumption of or production of renewable energy?
What we needed to do is to transition, because we had an incumbent network that was basically paid for by the taxpayer, that governments actually built the assets. And so we needed to create an environment where other investment could come in and over time become competitive. The really good news is that renewables have become much more cost competitive much quicker than anybody had anticipated. So it means that the level of support they receive is 4/5 lower than it was when this scheme started, and is due to be phased out from next year. All we're saying as an industry is leave that system in place. It's self-regulating. It actually tapers out to nothing, and support the industry. The other point is that particularly solar is overwhelmingly installed by people on lower incomes. So it's people on self-funded retirees.
Is it really?
It is.
That surprises me.
It's actually an inverse relationship. So in a city, you won't see much solar. Go out and into the mortgage belts and into rural and regional Victoria, and you'll see tons of solar there. It's these people. So the issue with solar, though, is when you buy a solar system, 25 years' worth of electricity up front. So you've got to get over this big capital cost purchase price. And what the scheme currently does is it lowers the bar marginally, but it lowers it sufficiently to let those people who need it most get over it. If you take that away, you actually lock out the people who most benefit from the scheme, and therefore it's actually an equity question as well.
I might ask you, Matthew, just while the audience formulate their...
Warming up.
While they're warming up. I mean, what is your organisation's position on the RET?
Yeah, look, I mean, so to your question, the fundamental, and I think we lose this a bit, the fundamental thing we're trying to achieve with this is to decarbonise our economy. So renewables is a byproduct, is a sort of part of the technology response to that, but it's not the end in itself. And obviously renewables have low or zero emissions, but it's about the emissions, not about the technology per se. Now, a really interesting bit of work, I think it's a great bit of work done by a guy from Deutsche Bank called Mark Lewis in 2008. He calculated what's the real scarcity value of a tonne of CO2 globally. That's the magic number. That's what we're really sort of facing. And it's about $100.
What's the scarcity value?
$100 a tonne.
What is a scarcity value?
Oh, well, that means what's the tonne of carbon CO2 worth, as in what... CO2 is a stock that accumulates in the atmosphere. So if you accept sort of basic threshold levels of what we can tolerate without tripping dangerous climate change, what can you afford to release and how much is that worth? That's about $100 a tonne. So in a purist sense, that's the single measure you would apply globally if you had control of the world to transform the global economy, because that would drive in renewables, it would drive a whole range of responses. Now, the real problem is, of course, that's proven to be much more difficult, and the Europeans are a classic example of a group of countries that have moved early on climate change, set up emissions trading schemes, hit a really serious sovereign debt crisis, and effectively park their carbon price to near zero, because as a group, they can't afford to dial it up at the levels they need to kind of drive the transformation. And they're facing really similar problems that we face in Australia. So the other thing that's going on in developed economies, which has surprised a lot of people, but shouldn't be surprising, is we've begun to aggressively deindustrialise. So electricity demand in Australia has been falling since 2008, when it was anticipated that it would keep growing along with the economy as it has for the last 50 years. Now, when you look around, you see that this has actually been occurring in all developed economies, and it's a function of the industrialisation of China and other developing economies and those transfers that are occurring. And we're seeing it with aluminium smelters closed, and with the car industry closing, and with pressure on large emitting industries. Now, it's not really the cost of energy here, it's high labour costs and it's the high dollar. But the net effect is our emissions, I think the report came out today, our emissions from the electricity sector fell by about 3% in the last year, driven heavily by deindustrialisation. So that's going on in the background. The result is we have this really serious oversupply of generation in Australia at the moment. And our problem with the RET is It's that we just think it's broken. And it was designed for a growth market. It was designed for renewables to fill that sort of take up that space of growing investment in new generation. And now the RET's trying to force generation into a market that's oversupplied. So it's about 7,000 to 10,000 megawatts of oversupplied generation in the market. Now, economists say it should leave. It should. The wholesale price of electricity is too weak. Those old power stations should be closing, but they're not closing. And they're my member companies, and they're not closing. And so there's...
And why aren't they closing?
Well, range of speculation, but it's probably game theory, because once somebody leaves, the wholesale price recovers. And remembering, old coal-fired power stations are relatively cheap to run without a carbon price. So, in a sense, that's the game for them. The really big problem is that the brand new gas generators. So, companies like Origin, AGL, and AGL and Energy Australia built sort of gas power stations towards the end of last decade, anticipating a carbon price and beginning this transition to sort of lower emissions technology. They were going to dial off coal and bring in gas. And they're the power stations that are being stranded. So they're much more expensive with high gas prices to run. So you have this perverse situation of everything you wanted to happen isn't happening. Now, it's not the fault of the RET. The concern we've got is, we say notionally a 20% target, but actually we think we have to go back and rethink how we're going to drive this transformation, because the rule book isn't working the way that the RET was designed to work.
Down the front.
Well, I'd like to see Australia using its beautiful sunshine and all other sorts of sustainable energy. And I'm wondering what you think of the GetUp scheme, where they're pushing the idea of a New Zealand company. I think it's called Power
Shop.
Shop, yes. Is that the only way that me as a consumer can force companies like AGL to go to cleaner energy? If we all leave them in droves, we might be able to have a...
Okay, you raised a couple of really good points there. So the first, and the important thing, so CSIRO put out a terrific report last year which got almost no coverage, called The Future Grid, and it looked at this transformation, and it was a really broad group of stakeholders, and they calculated conservatively. This is the conservative number. It's like a $230 billion rebuild of the energy system in Australia to deliver the transformation required. Now, at the moment, the problem is large-scale wind farms and other renewable projects are uninvestable, just like large-scale anything is uninvestable, because uninvestable, banks will not lend you money for those projects because they are losing money at the moment because of the oversupply. With no carbon price and with a weak wholesale price, in effect, it means those projects are losing money. So the investability of this sector is fundamental. If you're going to have that scale of transformation, it needs to be, you've got to have banks willing to lend and companies with a balance sheet to borrow and invest in those new projects. So, destroying, it's kind of a frustration from our perspective. Destroying incumbent players simply for the sake of it is not really an answer. Businesses that don't respond and are laggards and don't make the right strategic decisions, sure, that's fine. But this is, so destroying those. In the case of the GetUp, Power Shop's doing, this is kind of a separate issue. Power Shop's doing something really interesting, what I think is interesting about Power Shop's offering is that really the electricity sector, and I think as retail businesses, we're moving from being a utility to a consumer good. And it's a you think that should be a fairly swift transition, but I think we're learning how that responds and how we change. So Power Shop's really come in with a kind of what I think is a contemporary app-based, dynamic retail offering to customers. And I think
do you want to just give us a really brief idea of what that is for those who aren't familiar with it?
It's nothing terribly radical. It just makes the interface with your retail, your electricity use and the way you're billed a lot more accessible. Right. So, and they've kind of dialed it up. That's really the game.
And now, it's carbon neutral.
Well, no, it's actually not.
They've pledged to be carbon neutral.
Well, but they're not. You see, you can buy green power from Origin. You can buy green power from all the retailers. So there's a bit of a grey area there. They talk about being 100% renewables, but the initial offering is not renewable. You have to specifically ask for it. Now, I'm just interested because what GetUp is doing is GetUp is crossing a line. This is an ideological, intellectual question, but GetUp to me is an activist group, but maybe that's changed in the 21st century. They've turned into the marketing wing for a company. Now, I think that's an interesting transition because I've always thought the power of Greenpeace and other activist groups was their true independence. And whenever Greenpeace gets challenged about its relationship with any political party or anyone, it says, no, we're independent. Now, GetUp has has now it's basically a marketing wing for an energy retailer. So that's changed the rule book there, but maybe that's the 21st century. That's the way that those groups fund, and maybe that's okay. So I think the interesting thing is that we're seeing more dynamic and creative retail in electricity, and we're going to see more of it.
You wanted to make a point, John?
Yeah, no, excellent. This is a classic problem. The problem is big business, vested interests, heavy lobbying power versus the people. And let me explain what I mean. Electricity operates as a market like any other market. When there is scarce supply and high demand, prices rise. So typically prices are the most expensive during periods of peak demand. Now in Victoria, in 2009, before the Black Saturday bushfires, demand peaked, and the price for that electricity per megawatt hour was $5,000 per megawatt hour was the wholesale price. That's $5 per kilowatt hour, and you currently pay around maybe 28 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see it's a lot of money. This year we had very similar climatic conditions, and we had a very similar level of demand at the same time with the big heat waves that came through at the beginning of this year. And the difference was this time round we had lots of solar and some wind just pouring electricity into the grid. And of course that electricity is being produced at zero marginal cost. Sunshine and wind are free. So it meant that the wholesale price at that time was not $5,000 per megawatt hour, but $500 per megawatt hour. The net result is lower electricity bills for everybody. But the big loser are the incumbent fossil fuel power companies who made their profits in that 30 or 40 hours per year when those really outrageous prices came to play. Now, the government's response to this new incumbent technology is to say this is diabolical. We've got to cut renewables out.
Way too successful.
Way too successful. These big companies are hemorrhaging, these big fossil fuel companies, even though the scheme was designed to transition to low carbon generation, right? So we say to Mr Abbott, that's wrong. What you should be doing is developing a scheme not to cut out the new technology, the future, but rather to take the opportunity to retire the most polluting, least efficient, oldest coal-fired power stations.
But how do you do that? How do you retire? I mean, it's a great idea, and anyone sort of looking at the project, the problem logically would go, that's exactly what we should do.
Here's an idea.
How does that happen?
Remember, this is a government that wants to take direct action measures, right? What better direct action measure could they take than to partially fund the exit of some of those now unneeded, dirty polluters?
And how would your members take that, Matthew?
I know. I mean, I think it's... This was offered, so as contract for closure was put up, the Gillard government proposed this, and in the end there was no deal. And we're really interested in why there was no deal. It's a commercial issue between different businesses, but a lot of people, Anna included, we're all going, surely the oldest ones should have got away under that scheme, and it didn't. I think there's an appetite for... Look, we have to create headroom. If we're going to bring renewables in, which appears to be the case, we have to remove redundant generation to make that happen. That's absolute... It does not work unless we do that. So and I think there's a greater appetite for that now than there was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. So, yeah, I think that's
but not appetite within the government, though, at this point.
It's how you do it, and I mean it's in a way where you make sure it's the most efficient. That you sort of, and I think it's we think that's the right way of going, but we're looking at the detail of how you prosecute that. But it's the only way of getting the renewables in.
All right, please. Oh yes, over there in the corner.
Thanks. I guess one of the questions I have there is then if we would start retiring some of these generators, does that start to destabilise the grid, and then therefore what does our future grid look like?
Yeah.
Can I ask maybe for Anna we'll give John and Matthew a break.
There's been a lot of reports on what the future grid could look like. So the report that Matthew talked about just before had 4 different scenarios depending on whether heaps of consumers put solar on their roof and have local generation, whether we have large-scale solar and wind. There's different ways it could go. My organisation published a report yesterday, which is now on our website, which looks at what would the grid look like when we're zero carbon energy, and we have to be by about 2050. And the good news is Australia's actually got an abundance of choice. We could be 100% renewables, and I'll explain why in a moment. We could be about 3/4 renewables and the remaining quarter carbon capture and storage, so keeping some of the coal-fired or gas-fired going and capturing it and storing it, or even using nuclear in that remaining quarter. On a cost basis, they were all quite similar. When you assume that there's a carbon constraint, whether it's a carbon price or an emissions standard, right? How does the 100% renewables case work when it's not sunny and windy all of the time? There's been modelling to look at the worst case scenario would be a cloudy day that's still. So there's people using electricity, but there's not sun and wind. You can achieve about half to 2/3 of the electricity mix with what's called variable electricity, and it's the last third that really matters for that baseload. The good news is battery technology has improved so much in the last few years that this evidence from CSIRO tells us that you can now use batteries with large-scale solar combined with some other renewable baseload such as geothermal, which doesn't depend on the sun and the wind, but needs a bit more effort for us to prove it up in Australia. And also wave power is really coming along. There's now 2 operating pilots in Australia. Again, it'll need another 10 or 15 years for that to really be large scale, but there's actually enough wave and tidal energy to produce a fair-sized chunk of Australia's power needs. It's also a bit variable though, it's not always wavy, so you still need these batteries. Now I've seen them, they're about shipping container size, really large scale, and on King Island, that's where we're using them the most at the moment. King Island's, as you know, an island, and it's trying to produce itself as 100% renewable energy to avoid having to build another massive connection across the water. And so it's invested in these batteries, even though they're not quite as cost-effective just yet. But once we have more of them, they'll improve. And they can already do about 80% of their entire energy mix on renewables because they've got these batteries. It's expected that batteries will continue to improve. The scientists have to test what temperature is best when you decharge it and when you charge it, work all that stuff out. But even in the last few years, we've seen where the research said the costs would be in 2030 would be about half of what they are now. But in fact, CSIRO is telling us that some batteries are already there at that 2030 price now. And in Europe, we're seeing household-size batteries in Germany being probably competitive with the grid. I'm hearing that it could be in the next 5 years. So you could it could be cost competitive depending on what market you're in. So there is good reason to be hopeful now that technology will complement the variability and we could be 100% renewables.
So I'll come to you in a second, Lee, but just taking us back to our big theme, which was the renewable energy target. If we are going to achieve that future, what role would maintaining that target have? I mean, could you do it without that target or not?
You'd need an equivalent policy set. So as Matthew was saying, it doesn't have to be the RET, but it needs to be a carbon constraint. So the market needs a signal to say it's time to replace the stuff that has already been paid for but emits carbon and replace it with something new. And there is cost in that, there's no doubt about that, but we modelled those costs and it assumes that there is either a standard or an emission. So the US is setting standards or you have carbon pricing, right? But you do need something like that to trigger it. And so the response to the discussion about the RET, Matthew's right in saying we need a way to retire the old fossil fuel plants, and at the moment they're playing a who blinks first game and hoping that they can hold on longer, so the other guy goes, then they can keep going. Right? Our response would be, now is not the time to remove the RET. When we know the long-term goal is to continue to have more renewables, not less, you'll need the RET or something like it, as well as a policy to help the guys work out who blinks first. And there are costs with environmental remediation. If you close down these sites, they were built so long ago, they haven't actually set aside provisions, as I understand it, and there's a possible way to support them there. So there's got to be something along those lines that's been worked out. But you need something to continue to drive the transition because otherwise the incumbents have an advantage.
Okay. Liam.
Just following on from what you're talking about on King Island and taking that another perspective, if we're focusing on decentralised energy and what the future may look like, the context, I suppose the example we would have is in using those battery-powered systems in a mobile sense. So essentially what we've used is really a trailer with a ton of batteries, literally a ton of batteries in the back, that you can take around and substitute a standard diesel generator for, and use that within different contexts to power events and festivals or anything that you'd like, really. And I suppose one thing that we found in that is the way we perceive things is that, as a culture, I suppose, is that we have to substitute what we have had with something that fits the bill, that you can change automatically. But what we've found in doing the events and the work that we've done is probably the biggest change is the thinking of people that times have changed. The lights that we have in this room here are LED lights. They're not not all of them are actually, but the old lights that you'd use at a festival, which the old Parcan lights that you would have seen back in the day would use 1,000 watts on them themselves, which is what we can run a whole sound system for these days. So I suppose the point I'm making is that times have changed, and it's not just about changing what we've had before with something that does exactly the same role. Really, there's a relationship between us as consumers and the way we consume, and to be able to think more forwardly about how we consume. And the example that you raised earlier about Power Shop and how we interact with that current system, I suppose what you're saying is there is an opportunity for us to demand more from the people that provide us services, and that really we should be in a position now to be smarter about what is out there and what we want, and to be able to utilise the power that we have as consumers to be able to demand a different type of power.
Good question there.
Do the costing modelling include what the environment needs to provide in order to create, for example, the battery banks? I just have a feeling that we were talking about the old, let's say, gas-powered and coal-powered facilities, particularly with coal power. They've been up for a long time, or whatever else. What are we digging out of the earth now to make these battery banks, etc.?
Who'd like to answer that?
So just to comment, I suppose the first thing is to say that 100% renewables is absolutely feasible. University of New South Wales modelled it, and then the Australian government, actually forced by the Greens in the last term of government, also modelled the cost of 100% renewable powered Australia. And if you have enough wind and solar and geothermal and tidal in disparate geographic locations around Australia, they modelled Australia's power demand hour by hour back over, I think it was over 10 years. And they said that we can match supply from demand, because it might not be blowy in one place, but it is in the other. It might be, sunny in or sunny in over on the west coast and not on the east coast. So, with geographic dispersion, you can certainly save the problem. In relation to battery technologies, I think there are two big trends that are converging. One is the electric vehicle push. Literally billions of dollars are being spent on battery technology today to develop very energy-dense, low-form batteries for electric vehicles. So a lot of that is coming out of the US and out of China in particular.
Is that consumer-driven, that demand?
It is, and they know if they can crack it, if they get cost-effective, high-quality batteries for electric vehicles, that's kind of a golden goose. They can profit from. The spin-off is increasingly low-sized battery packs that can be used in people's garages, for example. The other trend that's coinciding with that is that people are going to drop off their state-based feed-in tariffs in the next couple of years. Here in Victoria, I think it's December 2015, lots of people are on the feed-in tariff. That'll stop. In New South Wales, it's 2016. So it's coming at just the right time when battery technology is coming down in cost. So people don't want to send that power back into the grid. They want to use them themselves. But let me say one third point, and directly to your question, and that is this. Pumped hydro is a form of battery storage, where you actually use water, you pump it up when you've got more electricity, and you put it through a turbine and use gravity when you don't. There are great technologies that are being invented in Australian universities today based on, actually, batteries based on water technology. And it's that innovation that is being shut down by the Abbott government in targeting and shutting down the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which funds many of these developments. So, as a snapshot.
But that doesn't really answer the question. The question was, I'll put it in old-fashioned terms. I know a battery that contains lead, it contains acid, it has very strong casing. all these ingredients that go to make a battery have to be provided by planet Earth somehow or another. So, what's the advantage? What does the modelling show us that environmentally creating all these battery banks is going to be an improvement? I accept the first part of your discussion or argument, which says that yes, the provision of power can come from wind, air and wherever else, but it's the storage that I really question.
That's a very reasonable question.
Yep.
Who
and
wants to
so
answer?
my research has looked into a little bit of this, but there might be others who would know more as well. Lithium is a big component of modern batteries. So I think the last point that John was making was that technology is evolving all of the time, so we don't need to have lead-acid batteries anymore. Instead, if the battery that powers your laptop, for example, would be a lithium-ion battery. We looked at exactly this question of, have we got any lithium and is there enough? Turns out Australia's got heaps. Actually, we could become one of the more dominant providers and have an export industry in lithium. Now, that still involves mining, obviously, and so we looked at what are the emissions from mining and found that we can have a renewable energy powered mining sector. So at the moment, for example, you've got lots of diesel trucks and heavy machinery, but you can replace some of those trucks with conveyor belts that are electric and therefore powered by solar. Or you could use fuel cells in the trucks, where the fuel cells are created by hydrogen that's created through, again, electricity that's made on site. So that's one example of how modern battery technology it uses different ingredients, so to speak. Speaking again about what's in the lab, this battery idea of using liquids is something that's called organic flow batteries, and it's not yet commercial, so we need more work on that. But as I understand it, and I'm not a scientist, it does involve the flow of water from one very large tank into another, and the storage is the energy from the one tank goes into the other. And that's being researched right now, so that could possibly avoid the lithium even. But for the moment, we've modelled a lithium-based battery for a significant share of that work.
You know, 6 years ago when the renewable energy target was being legislated, everyone was very bullish about geothermal. And all the modelling showed geothermal taking a big chunk of the target. And basically this is a technology where you drill 5 kilometres down to very hot rocks, you send water down, it takes the heat and comes back up and you circulate it around. Now this is 6 years later, it's supposed to be generating thousands of watts of electricity and not 1 watt has been generated. So there's always a risk in all these debates, no matter what we talk about. When we're talking about future technologies, there is the propensity for things we think are going to happen to not happen, and other things we didn't anticipate to happen instead. So I think the story. I hosted a lunch with the head of Siemens in Germany, the global R&D head, and they're looking at batteries furiously, and they're in these huge partnerships and big corporates trying to solve these problems. He reckons 10 years away. Now, I've spoken to other people who say 5, I've said others who say 20, and so the storage thing's a live debate. I think to answer your question partly, the moment at the household level, I think that it's relatively expensive. So we've looked at about $23,000 to get half a day's electricity from a battery in your garage. That may eventually come down, but at the moment, on the current technology, which is quite mature, that's pretty expensive. I think it's more likely you'll see it first being deployed by the network businesses. So in San Diego, they found where there's lots of solar in the street, it's cheaper now for them just to stick a big battery at the end of the street and use that to balance the solar supply than it is to try and upgrade all the poles and wires. So they're the first movers, and you'll see as they scale it out, that's where it'll go first. The useful thing is, the other thing to bear in mind is whatever they're made from is, you know, the principles around recycling are all about scale. They're just like any resource. If you've got enough of them and you've got them in sufficient density and at scale, then they're always recoverable and reusable. So whether it starts in cars and moves through houses and eventually gets recovered, I've got a lot more confidence in being able to recover and reuse batteries, whatever they're made from, than other things, resources we're using. So I think that's a reasonably manageable part of the battery. They're certainly going to be part of the mix. It's just a question of how and where, and really, you know, only time will tell us the full deploy of that technology.
Do you use rare earths in these batteries?
Well, you do.
No? Someone said no?
There's one there was a battery technology. I'm trying to remember the metal. That was mobile phones. There's companies in Australia that mine rare earths that make a lot of money until someone finds a substitute, and
exactly.
then they don't make any more money. So it's just very fluid. Everyone's trying to get away from anything that's scarce because it's expensive.
There's one more technology that can help. How big a battery do you even need? And that is demand management technologies. So your iPhone can now turn on your appliances at a time that suits you. And it won't be long until you can properly connect them all up, so all of your appliances can talk to you wherever you are on your tram or anything, and they can have in their brains the electricity price. So this peak demand issue, obviously the price should spike when something becomes scarce, and you can program some of your appliances, washing machine, whatever it is that it's not time critical, to respond to the price, and that's not very far away either. And so that will help determine, well, I don't need a half a day's energy for $23,000 maybe, if I'm happy to wait half a day and run my washing machine at another time. Now that doesn't mean, obviously at night you will need to store, but there's some peak smoothing that can be done with another technology that then can mean the battery doesn't need to be as big.
Who's going to teach us to do that app in our phone? That's the big question. They're going to be enough. Okay, so you had a question down there. Was it you in the check shirt? No? No?
It was answered. It was just about recycling the batteries.
Very good. Okay. Yes, go for it.
I was just going to pose a question to you, Matthew. You're saying the RET's not working. And if that's the case, that's fair enough too. But if we were just to make a free market and basically just say, let's not compensate either side of the energy industry, be it the fossil fuel or the renewable, let's just play the free market and let's see how we go. Let all these technologies evolve as they do, and they will, and basically the consumers can equally supply electricity as the companies do. I mean, where I see it, we're basically back in the cop and co. Cars come along and they basically put a demand on the actual fuels. But now, I mean, cop and co, to me it seems a bit unfortunate that the companies have actually made investments that basically aren't in line with sort of the competitive marketplace that will emerge.
Look, so we're clear. I mean, these transformations are occurring everywhere right now. So we're not unique. So I think Uber, so technology is unlocking and changing the value of taxi plates in cities, and we have quite perverse responses from governments protecting the rights of taxi drivers because we now can contact other people to get drivers around instead. We hit... I used to work in newspapers. We hit peak newspaper in 1990, and we haven't seen a sort of an efficient transformation in the dissemination and prosecution of complex issues, and I think we're all poorer for that, and I think we'll feel that. So we don't always have decisive transformation of technology. Sometimes it just lingers and doesn't transform. We've probably hit peak electricity in 2008. Now, all the modelling was showing it was going to increase. It's decoupled. That's right. I mean, everyone takes risks in these things. The underlying problem with the oversupply is largely government-driven. The government's built most of the power stations that are now the power stations that have been either bought or not bought by private sector, and they're the ones who imposed other policy legislation to bring new generation in on the anticipation that you'd have further demand growth. That hasn't occurred. The reality is you can argue the toss on how you're going to do this, but you've got to get the old stuff out in order to make this transformation occur. I think you're right too. So in Europe they have exactly the same problem, and the utilities got together last year and they met at the Art Gallery in Brussels, the Magritte Gallery, so they call themselves the Magritte Group. And what they said, this is the big heavy utilities across Europe, and there are 51 gigawatts of gas power stations that are mothballed in Europe, which is like 100 power stations, because they've got chronic oversupply, they've got high gas prices, no carbon price, and they're all firing up coal again, just like the same problem we have here. They've said, all we want is a high carbon price and nothing else. If you give us €70 a tonne carbon, we will go and build all the kit we need and we'll transform this for you, and then we can actually resolve all these issues. And solar goes where it's efficient, and the wind and all the new technologies are unlocked, and people invest and it goes forwards. And the European Commission said, thanks very much, that's lovely, just over there, we'll come back when we need you. So that's the same challenge we have, and I suspect if we were to be completely honest, that's what we'd want as an industry, is one single decisive measure which would unlock...
Hang on, did I just hear you say as an industry you want a carbon price?
Yeah, we always have.
Right,
yeah, we always have. We've never changed. We help...
That's not the general message. that I get
We
from the electricity providers.
We helped design the first emissions trading scheme. We helped design the second emissions trading scheme. Despite the government changing its position, other industry associations, we've sustained our support for a well-designed emissions trading scheme. So, and I think what we're moving to is, if you get that right, in the perfect world, that's all you need, because that's what government should do, and then you allow innovation to drive the rest. The political reality is something quite different as we're living through in all parts of the world, not just here.
And the big problem for why the free market alone won't get us there, in theory it should. These technologies will eventually come down in cost and there'll be a crossover. The climate science is the problem. There is a ticking clock. So as Matthew mentioned at the start, CO2 is a stock, so every day that we emit, it stays up there for around 100 years. So every day longer that we're emitting, more is going in. And the science is telling us that we've worked out how much more carbon can go into the atmosphere until we hit that tipping point, which the governments have agreed is 2 degrees warming. And beyond that, climate change gets very dangerous in layman's terms. That budget would run out in 17 years if we didn't change what we're doing right now. And the research is telling us that we can make it last until 2050 if we start a good accelerated transition now. So the problem is accelerating what the market would probably do anyway. And if it wasn't for that CO2 hanging around in the atmosphere problem, we could maybe, as you say, let the Cobb & Co story happen. So the reason for a carbon price is to say it's fine if the market's free as long as you're pricing the market externality, which is the cost of the pollution.
Well, it's worse than that. The dice are loaded against us. And what I mean by that is the renewable energy target costs the taxpayer nothing. It's actually a market scheme where actually the electricity, the polluters need to pay for it, but the offset, remember I said that renewables push down the costs of wholesale electricity prices, actually results in lower bills. So even Mr Abbott's hand-picked fossil dinosaurs conceded that point, right? But the issue is this: the fossil fuel industry receives subsidies of around $9 billion a year. And it's even worse than that, because they're locked in the tax code. So it's actually tax breaks in the tax law. They're not in some sort of bucket which is discretionary spend that governments come and go and fight over. They're actually baked into our tax law. So you talk about a level playing field. Let's have a level playing field. Let's have the imperative of carbon, and let's actually get a better outcome.
Sorry, John, what are those tax? It's not true.
There's been a whole range of studies done, and different people have different figures. There's a lot of consensus. So the diesel fuel excise, tax breaks for mining exploration for fossil fuels. There's a whole bunch of them which are fossil fuel tax breaks which load the dice in favour of fossil fuels and against renewables.
The only one that is real is the fact there's no price on carbon. So if you accept that the risk of dangerous climate change, that's the one that needs to be redressed. And it doesn't have to be a price. There are other mechanisms of constraining CO2, but something's got to be there and in place, and ultimately there in a bipartisan way, because this is a sustained policy agenda for the next 30 to 50 years. And it's very frustrating that we continue to have a politicisation of energy and climate policy, because it's difficult to execute anything under the current climate.
I think your conclusion's one we can all agree on.
Yeah.
You had a question?
I was just reading this morning about the Rockefeller Foundation moving out of investments into fossil fuels and into renewables. Is that the sort of push that we're hoping to encourage in Australia as well, to try and put financial pressure on the fossil fuel industry? Divestment is a big issue, and people are recognising that when it comes to these policies, we are powerful. We only don't have power when we concede power to other people. So as a community, we can demand of our government that they have a better renewable energy policy. One positive thing that individuals can do is really look at where their superannuation funds are. Look at which bank you bank with. Do they have a policy not to back fossil fuel projects? And if they do, move your money, because money talks. And so increasingly, these are becoming the tobacco industry of the future, right? And so I think that they will come under pressure. I think they should come under pressure. And as individuals, we have the power to help make that change.
I think this is done and dusted. So I reckon middle of last decade, was the decisive moment on climate policy. So the science is vast, colossal, and there are many points of prosecuting different disagreements and where that's going, and I suspect it will change many times in our lifetime. But what industry realised, and this is global, globally, about the middle of last decade was this isn't a science issue, this is a risk issue. And they someone started doing the numbers on what the risks were of not acting on climate change now, and they saw the risk premiums and the insurance deal, and they just went, this is a no-brainer, we move. So from that point onwards, it started with the insurance industry, went to the banking industry, and now, if you try and borrow money for a coal-fired power station anywhere in the world, the bank will say, look, that's a 40, 50-year investment. Just can you explain to us how you're going to manage the back-end risk of the carbon liability that thing has? And if you can, we'll lend it to you. But that's now just part of the deal. So for that reason, it's extremely unlikely you'll ever see a new coal-fired power station built in Australia ever again, and that's a given. But it's more, so banks are now, and I think that's generally accepted across most leading blue-chip companies are all working on this, irrespective of government policy. But at the end of the day, the role of government is ultimately to do that decisive, clear signal that they are imposing that price or that constraint on CO2, and then you'll find business tends to move it's ready to go. So that's the frustration we have, is the disconnect between where the business community has been at for a while and what we actually have in terms of real policy.
We've got about 8 minutes left, so if you've got questions, don't be shy. Yes, absolutely, and we'll try and make the most of them.
Germany's an interesting case, lots of solar and wind, etc., but they're also commissioning 2 1,000 megawatt coal-fired units with dirty brown coal at Norath power stations, so they must have borrowed the money from somebody.
Yeah, I know there's a couple in the US as well, so it's possible. Their problem is they're banned nuclear. So they've after Fukushima, and this is part of the frustration, is that they have nuclears, but they're basically decommissioning them, and that's a consumer response to that issue, which probably you can have a view on it, but I think you're talking about apples and oranges with old coal nuclear power stations and potentially new ones. But look, so in the sense, all the renewables have done in Germany is displace the emissions that are transferring from nuclear to fossil fuels in Germany, so they're not making any headroom. And it's not the fault of the renewables; it's the fault of that other policy. There's a report I found the other day which was eye-watering. In the US, they've calculated the likely cost of renewable subsidies in Germany through to 2023, and they think it'll be $884 billion US. So
subsidies for renewables.
Yeah. So, and this is because in the absence of a carbon price, the sort of renewables policy is doing all the lifting and costing a fortune, and that's not ideal. So again, that's not the fault of the technology, but I think, to be really honest. Anna's right in the accelerated response. I think what we've learned is that having multiple pronged strategies that all work on certain premises to drive the outcome can end up with perverse outcomes, and we have that with the RET now. No one foresaw this was going to be a problem when the RET was passed, and yet, so what do we do? I think realistically, for political reasons, we'll manage the RET and fix it in some way, but we need to be kind of clearer and smarter when we re-prosecute these issues in the future. For Germany,
obviously there's a big problem. It's called Vladimir Putin. And Germany gets its power from gas from Russia. And Putin sits on the big gas line, right? And the Germans are really scared that he's going to turn off the flow, right? So it's security that's pushing German energy policy as much as anything else.
I thought I just heard you say, Matthew, that there's an oversupply of gas.
No, the gas isn't... So gas... Okay, gas thing's amazingly complex in Europe, but it's interesting. So the gas story is all about the Ukraine, but the Western European countries have really been carefully working to decouple their reliance on Russian gas. But the issue's around NATO now. So NATO has expanded into Eastern Europe, and part of the way the Europeans work is energy security is a crucial part of the informal part of the NATO alliance. So it's getting gas to those Eastern Bloc countries who are exposed to Russian gas supply, which is more the deal. And then, so the Russians have renegotiated the gas deal to supply gas to China, and that's part of our gas contracts out of Australia. So the Australian gas is then going to resupply through back to Europe. The problem then is the European gas pipes can't run two ways at the same time, and they're running the wrong way at the moment. So you can get the gas into Spain, but it can't get to Italy, where there's going to be a constraint because the gas is running the other way at the moment. So, yeah, it's a little more complicated.
That's a big mess. That's a big hot mess. I'll get to your two questions just there in a second. But Liam, I just wanted to ask you really quickly. You run a company which supplies solar and renewable energy. Do you make any money? Are you subsidised?
No, we're not subsidised, although that would be helpful.
Do you make any money?
Yeah, we make money doing what we're doing. But I mean, I suppose the relationship we had, it's not purely on an energy company type basis. What we do is we work with learning institutes like RMIT University, Southern Cross University, and basically we hire for a fee, a service really, which by coupling I suppose power is no good on its own. You need it to power something for the service that it provides. So what we do is couple the power with the service, and therefore are able to charge for that. So it's a niche opportunity.
And you're not in retail either, it's a much more niche.
No, we're at a smaller level. I suppose what we offer is we're trying to I suppose break down the barriers between people. I mean, in these conversations here, we're talking at quite high level, and quite often when we're talking about renewable energy and the like, it's what's on our roofs and it's what's in our walls. But we also, through what we're doing, is to highlight that power and the way we interact with it and the way we use it can be very interactive and part of our other aspects of our life, and it shouldn't be something that we keep to the side and that's talked about in government, and it's not talked about, it's not something that you have at the back of your house. It is something that is essential to what we do, and that we should look at it differently and engage with it as much as we can in other avenues.
That's a very good point. Yes, you had a question.
Given what you've said about the possibilities of being carbon neutral by 2050 and the plans that are in place, but the way that government policy is sort of scrapping everything to do with renewable in Australia and funding to research and everything else, is there sort of anything positive you can say about what might actually happen in Australia by 2050?
That's a really good question to end on, and so let's just go, we'll start with Matthew and we'll work this way back, and if you can just, keep it fairly tight.
The political cycle's short term, so this is ebbs and flows, and I think we will see, we will return and see transformation occurring in an organised fashion. It's just when and how. I think the really big challenge, though, is I actually think that the genie's almost out of the bottle anyway in Australia. We're seeing emissions falling aggressively in Australia, not through any government policy, just because of the way the economy is changing. And you're seeing that in most developed economies, and consumers, every time you buy a television, it's 20% more efficient. The appliances you use in your home and the sound systems are just so much more efficient. We're naturally changing the way we use energy, and that's just part of the 21st century. The really big challenge is going to be the international negotiations, because we still have this issue of developing economies developing at an incredible rate. I mean, the China miracle, I don't think we fully comprehend the extraordinary achievement of dragging 250 million people out of poverty in 10 years that they did in China. But that comes with this enormous energy boom and how we can drive those efficiency gains in China. Now, they're discovering in the West Coast is that they've created a middle class in the last 10 years. And middle class people who've driven the environmental outcomes in the developed world are the people now driving environmental performance in China. So they want clean air. Middle class people worry about the future. They worry about their kids' education, about the air they breathe, and about all the things we all do because we're all middle class people. So it's amazing. Can the Chinese middle class get hold of the way that they drive those economies fast enough to deliver those same transformation? So that's, we're part of the movement that's really going to determine the outcome, and we don't really realise it, but middle class people and the growth of middle class people is one of the great successes and the drivers of environmental performance globally.
I think in terms of the positivity that's possible and the potential is, I do find some of the discussion and what's happening of late a bit disempowering, but I think some of the possibilities that we've talked about is the fact that there is transformation occurring, and it's creating accessibility, and the whole centralised model, and the fact that there is literally being distributed, that there is that accessibility and people to be able to change the way that they engage with systems to make it work for you better. So I think that those possibilities in terms of smaller, more powerful batteries, okay, we need to work on some of the aspects of that, but the freedom and the opportunities that creates for people in remote areas and even in urban areas, I think it's the transformation, the accessibility that it allows for all of us to engage differently to get better outcomes.
Ultimately, it's a bit like the king on the beach telling the tide not to come in. This will prevail, this will become the new norm, but we're really in the trenches today. And in the short term, the good news is
that Labor, the Greens and the Palmer United Party have all absolutely pledged to keeping the existing renewable energy target in place as it is. So it means that Tony Abbott doesn't have the numbers in the Senate to change the legislation. That's good. But ultimately, we have a Prime Minister who believes that climate change is crap. And so we've got to do one of three things: change his policy position, change the leader, or change the government.
There's plenty of things that keep me positive. Knowing that we can get to carbon neutral in 2050 based on stuff that's already invented is really heartening, because the stuff that wasn't in the report are things that are still in the lab, like what Siro and Monash Uni in Melbourne are looking at, which is printable, flexible solar panels. So there will soon be a 3D printer that just spits out a solar panel and it bends, and you can put it anywhere. There's actually solar-powered clothing that I've seen invented. And so we didn't model that. It's not in the project. Stuff that's in the project is stuff we already know about. So that gives me heart that we will continue to accelerate this progress. But you're right to be disheartened by the policies that have been withdrawn. It is good to remember the detail of the Senate. So even though there's a pledge to remove ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, I sit on the board of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and that's made it for a difficult year for sure. But we haven't been abolished. The bill got put up twice and rejected twice. So the Senate is powerful, and it makes the politics difficult, and it has slowed investment down, it's true, but it's not over. It's definitely not all over. And what's happening during the current term of the government is that next year, this international summit that started yesterday, those discussions will culminate next December. Now, that meeting in Paris is the next Copenhagen. What's different is this meeting this week showed that business is willing to stand up this time, and they didn't stand up quite as loudly last time. So the Rockefeller announcement, the World Bank gathered a petition, calling for carbon pricing. 1,000 companies signed it, and 70 governments. 40 of those were countries and the other 30 were cities. China was in the list because they're having carbon pricing starting in the next couple of years. So the momentum is there. The meeting to watch is next December in Paris, and over the coming year, the countries will play this game of holding cards to the chest but also trying to reveal the cards and encourage others to do it. As Matthew said, when the energy companies get together, they recognise if we all do it at once and we get the big carbon price in, this transition will happen. So it's about hoping that international coordination can happen, and at the same time giving space for the technologies to make it happen faster, and use your own power as a consumer. You can buy an 8-star home now. It uses 80% less energy than the average minimum star that's needed. Ask your architect. Look for the designer. Find the bank that can do it. PowerShop is carbon neutral, and others can do it. You know, I'm still with one of the incumbent energy suppliers, but I pay for the 100% green power. So it's about remembering that there might be a little cost now, but it's a much bigger cost if we wait. So this is really the moment where the costs of acting on climate change come a bit more explicit, and we realise that it's not free to change over, but it's a lot less costly than having dangerous climate change.
That's a positive note to end on. Thank you very much, and a good reminder that all of us actually, do have powers above and beyond the machinations of the Senate, and who knows what Clive Palmer will do next. But if we could just thank our panel: Matthew Warren, Liam O'Keefe, John Grimes, and Anna Skarbek. This is the first in a series of question times that we're going to be holding here at the Wheeler Centre. We're going to be having 2 more over the next 2 months, and if you enjoyed it, then please come along to the next ones. Keep an eye out for the emails about what else is coming up. But thank you very much to our panel, and thank you tonight. Thank you.